The oldest American battleship to fight in World War II, as such, was Arkansas of the two-ship Wyoming class. Originally displacing 26,000 tons, by World War II this had grown to 27,900 tons. When work on these two riveted and flush deck ships originally started in 1908, there was considerable debate on what form they should take. As always, these mostly centered around the three all-important factors of propulsion, armament, and protection. There can be little doubt the lessons of the 1905 Battle of Tsushima were considered. The first of these was armament. Up to this point, the main gun size of battleships around the world had been 12 inches. It was known that other countries were working on larger guns, so many wanted to increase gun diameter to 14-inch. The only problem was there were no 14-inch guns. So, rather than build these ships to carry weapons that didn't exist yet, they got the next best thing. Namely, they carried one more turret than their predecessors. The guns were also increased from 45 to 50 caliber to help shells travel farther, faster, and straighter. The downside of this was there were no triple turrets, only twins. From an architectural point of view, this meant 6 large holes in the frame, which could only be safely accommodated by moving 2 midship and lengthening the ship by about a fifth over the previous class, lest the structural integrity be dangerously weakened at the ends. Inevitably, the 2 midship turrets had a rather limited field of fire. Worse yet, they had to be sandwiched between the machinery. The second was armor. Like all battleships of their era, they used the concept called incremental armor. This meant the armor was thickest midship on the sides, then incrementally got thinner as it spread to the ends, bottom, and around the deck. The idea here was that in a battle, ships would be shooting at each other from near point-blank ranges in flat trajectories, aiming for the center of mass or middle of the ship. In fact, most ships couldn't elevate their guns beyond 25 degrees at best, 45 degrees theoretically allowing the longest range. The third was propulsion. Remember, this is 1910, so coal burning was still the norm. These powered steam turbines. While it did the job, it was terribly inefficient. This, even as the Navy was starting to think offensively, taking the fight to the enemy, or at least protecting merchant shipping as it transported American goods around the world. Either way, it meant fighting far from home. Grudgingly, the Navy came to the acceptance that its most likely opponents in any future war would be Germany in the Atlantic or Japan in the Pacific. Unfortunately, Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet had been a near disaster. Mechanical breakdown and a lack of adequate logistical support had nearly stranded the fleet several times, and this was without the increased wear and tear of combat. Mechanical reliability and range became more important than speed. If the U.S. was to avoid being on the wrong side of a battle like Tsushima, things would have to change. Wyoming was started February 9, 1910, and finished September 25, 1912. Arkansas was started January 25, 1910, and finished September 17, 1912. Main armament was 12 12-inch 50 caliber guns in 6 twin turrets, 2 forward, 2 midship, and 2 aft. Each mount weighed 490 tons. Maximum gun elevation was 15 degrees, symbolic of the short ranges battles were expected to be fought at. Maximum range was 12 miles. They could be loaded at any angle and used a side-swinging breech block. 100 rounds were carried in the magazines for each gun. The guns could fire 3 rounds per minute per gun with a muzzle velocity of 2,100 feet per second. The rounds themselves were either an 870-pound armor-piercing shell with a 25-pound bursting charge, or a 740-pound high-explosive shell with a 58.2-pound bursting charge. Ammunition stowage was normally a mix of 75% armor-piercing and 25% high-explosive. During World War II, however, these percentages were reversed, a glaring indication of the older battleship's relegation to fire support rather than fighting surface battles. Secondary armament was 21 5-inch 51 caliber guns for use against destroyers, 17 in casemates along the hull below the main deck, 1 on either side near the bow below the barrels of turret 1. 5 were carried on either side midship. 2 more were carried on either side near the stern, below the barrels of turret 6. A single one was carried right at the stern. The remaining 4 were carried midship on the superstructure in single open mounts, 2 on either side. Each mount weighed 11.9 tons. Maximum gun elevation was 20 degrees. Maximum range was 8 3/4 miles. 230 rounds were carried in the magazines for each gun. The guns could fire 9 rounds per minute per gun with a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. The rounds themselves were 55.18 pounds with a 7 1/4 pound bursting charge. They also carried star shells for illumination at night. Turretary armament was 2 superstructure mounted 3-inch 50 caliber dual purpose guns in single open mounts, 1 on either side midship. While here in 1912 they were almost an afterthought, these guns would rise to considerable importance, arguably even outstripping the 12-inch main guns. By World War II, newer models of this gun would eventually become the standard heavy AA or even main gun on many second-string ships. Battleships, Omaha-class light cruisers, Wicks and Clemson-class destroyers recast in the escort role, early DEs and frigates, submarines, and a vast array of auxiliaries are only some of the ships that would use this gun in one form or another during the war. Each mount weighed 4.2 tons. Maximum gun elevation was 85 degrees. Maximum range was 7 1/4 miles with a ceiling of 30,400 feet in the AA role. The guns could fire up to 20 rounds per minute per gun with a muzzle velocity of 2,700 feet per second. The one-piece rounds themselves were 24 pounds with a 3/4 pound bursting charge. Training and elevation was usually by hand. Finally, 2 torpedo tubes were carried. These initially fired the Mark III and later the Mark IX torpedo. Propulsion was originally provided by 12 coal-burning boilers venting to a pair of funnels which powered steam-driven turbines to provide about 28,000 horsepower to 4 shafts for a top speed of 21 knots. Armor was okay. The important thing here to remember is that at the time ships were expected to fire horizontally at each other. There was no real thought of plunging shells or falling bombs yet. An upper or casemate 11-inch belt and a lower 11-inch external armor belt ran the side of the ship from turret 1 to turret 6, the two halves meeting just above the waterline, creating an armored box with a 5-inch thick extension aft to protect the steering gear. This thinned to 9 inches near the top and bottom of the hull. On the inside, the ends of the box was formed by armored bulkheads 11 inches thick forward of turret 1 and 9 inches thick aft of turret 6. The bottom of the hull was protected against the then relatively new threat of mines by being double-hulled except midship where it was triple-hulled. The primary armored deck actually was not the main deck. Instead, it was the deck that ran the width of the ship where the upper and lower belts met. This was 1.5 inches thick, increasing to 2 inches over the magazine. The idea here was to keep damage above the waterline where it couldn't compromise buoyancy. Both the magazines and the machinery were beneath this deck and thus below the waterline. Armor on the main deck was just thick enough to prevent splinters from any hits to the superstructure from ricocheting into the ship's vitals. Barbette armor was up to 11 inches thick, and turret armor was up to 12 inches thick. Casemate armor for the midship secondaries was 6.5 inches. Finally, the conning tower had 11.5 inches of armor. Both of these ships were heavily modified during their lives. The first major round took place near the end of World War I. As a result of oil shortages, only coal-burning U.S. battleships could cross the Atlantic and operate with the British fleet. This gave both sides a chance to learn from the other. Operating in the stormy seas of the North Atlantic was much different than the tropics. The case-mated 5-inch guns were too near the water, making them useless in anything but glassy seas. So the forward pair and single tail gun were removed, as were the forward 5-inch deck guns on either side. Secondary armament was now 16 5-inch guns, 8 on either side. Local control rangefinders were added to the higher turrets 2, 3, and 5. Other directors and spotlights were also added or modified. Finally, the number of 3-inch AA guns was increased to 8. A pair on turret 3, a pair on turret 5, a pair on the aft superstructure in front of turret 5, and a pair midship. Aircraft wasn't a real threat yet, but it was useful for spotting. The largest overhaul was 1925 to 1927. Under the 1921 treaty, new ships couldn't be finished and many older ones had to be scrapped. Combined with the lessons of World War I, this meant existing ships were updated to remain in service. The most significant change was reboilering. The 12 coal-burning boilers were replaced with 4 oil-fired ones. Being more thermally efficient meant these maintained the same speed despite an increased weight and width, while allowing the number of funnels to be reduced to just 1. Bulges were fitted along the side to enhance underwater protection against torpedoes and mines, which had proved so effective in World War I. The torpedo tubes were also removed. No big loss since battle ranges had grown to the point of making them useless anyway. The rear cage mast was removed, and the rear superstructure between turret 4 and 5 was built up to a tripod. Of the 10 midship case-mated 5-inch guns, the forward 3 on each side were moved up 1 level to the main deck and built into a new gun house to keep them dry. The bottom of the structure overhung the side and helped shield the remaining guns from spray coming off the bow. On top of these new gun houses was moved the 8 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 4 on either side. The moving of the AA guns also allowed turret 3 to trade its rangefinder for a float plane catapult to launch 3 spotter aircraft. The gun directors were also updated to handle the expected longer ranges of fire. Finally, horizontal armor was increased to provide protection against falling bombs and plunging shells. 1 3/4 inches was added to the turret top. Armor over the engines was increased to 4 3/4 inches, and armor over the magazines was increased to 4.5 inches. In 1931, under the terms of the London Treaty, Wyoming was reduced to a gunnery training ship. The next major modification to Arkansas came in March through July 1942. 2 more 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were added to the upper deck near the rear mast. The remaining cage mast at the top of the tower was replaced with a tripod mast, and the 8 remaining 5-inch casemate guns below the main deck were removed along with the 2 open mounts. Finally, in September through November 1944, she was modified 1 more time in preparation for transferring to the Pacific. 2 more 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were added. Radar was fitted, and the bridge and rear mast were opened up and reduced respectively to increase anti-aircraft spotting and firing arcs. Arkansas was serving the Atlantic on December 7, 1941. She had already taken part in the occupation of Iceland and spent the first 2.5 years of the war mostly escorting transatlantic convoys and conducting gunnery training. In June 1944, she finally saw action by providing covering fire for the D-Day invasion and then transferred to the Mediterranean to support the invasion of southern France. At the start of 1945, she transferred to the Pacific and spent the rest of the war providing fire support for the invasions of first Iwo Jima and then Okinawa. Post-war, she was relegated to the Bikini bomb tests, where, as a result of the underwater test Baker, she sunk. In case you're wondering, that black spot near the mushroom base is the 28,000-ton Arkansas being upended stern first by the blast.